For those of you who remember the strange days that followed 9/11, this pandemic has had an eerie similarity, I think. There was, after all, a known threat. Through gratuitous news coverage, we were made painfully aware that some people had died, that something big had happened. There was all sorts of fear and anger, and yes, there was some doubt as well in the air, which persists even to this day. Get into that a bit later. But more than anything else, there was a lot of uncertainty in the air. Even though we knew what was happening, there was no real clear picture of how or why, or most vexingly, what might happen next. Was this the beginning of World War III? Who might be the next victim? How will they attack next? Who knew what and when? And how deep does this conspiracy even go? More so than the airplanes, this uncertainty was arguably more dangerous than the weapon itself. Yes, 3,000 people had died, and more would die in the coming days, and a monument to Americanism lay in ruins. But the events that were set in motion led to a transformation of the American people, and by extension global society. Of course, this sparked the forever war on terror, which started first in Afghanistan and then moved to Iraq for some reason, which then of course destabilized the entire Middle East, which led to ISIS and, continued war to this day. But more relevant to this discussion, a general paranoia reminiscent of McCarthyism started to descend and seize the popular imagination of the American people. Are there terrorists under your bed? How do you know? How do you know what a terrorist looks like? Who is a terrorist? Oopsie doodle daisy, we did a racism and accidentally generated a whole bunch of Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism. Oops. And more so than was even the case before, both individual and governmental attention became fixated on the nature of risk. But not just the risk of another attack, but on the notion of risk itself, what Ulrich Beck and Anthony Giddens refer to as risk society. Whereas pre-modern societies faced mostly dangers from natural causes, the state of modern society is one in which the primary risks are of human origin. As such, we're motivated to regard our own activities through this lens of the mitigation and the management of risks. In his book on the matter, Beck draws attention to the impact of the Chernobyl disaster, collectively dissuading us from the use of nuclear energy at large and altering the course of our development in general. An example of what he calls reflexive modernization. Now, of course, the Chernobyl event didn't actually increase the risks of nuclear energy. It remained as safe or as dangerous as it had always been. But it did provide an example, an object example of the potential risk, which elevated the perceived likelihood and severity of that risk, which, of course, influenced both policymakers and the general public. In the case of 9/11, the evident attack represented the concrete evidence that a danger of terrorism exists, and an example of what terrorism might look like. Similarly, this induced heightened anxieties about the likelihood of future attacks and set the imagination wild on what the attack might look like. And so, driven by this need to manage risks of all kinds, we started doing weirder and weirder things at the airport, checking for shoe bombs and being suspicious of breast milk and X-ray voyeurism and all sorts of other things. None of these things ever actually caught anyone doing anything nefarious, of course, but they sure did result in a lot of harassment and racial profiling and, general frustration. And of course it didn't increase anybody's safety, but much as how an example of risk can heighten its perceived danger, this kind of security theater can also generate the perception of safety, at least on a surface level. Since nobody had any, real information, most of what we had to go on was effectively superstition, as Donald Rumsfeld notoriously called it, unknown unknowns. The trouble is, since neither the danger nor the mitigation strategy were strictly rational, the whole affair becomes easily unmoored from reality, and thereby it becomes easy to exploit. The most evident result of this is the USA Patriot Act and its derivatives. Masterful naming, by the way, really invokes this sense of urgency and Americanism. This established a massive domestic surveillance program with consequences for both Americans and America's allies abroad, as well as their enemies, of course. But also it generated a general acceptance of the curtailment of civil liberties and the interests of security, trading away freedoms in exchange for the protection against this phantom terrorist threat. With this established, the hegemonic power need only invoke the idea, the spooky specter of terrorism to justify and elicit consent for damn near anything, really. This is in part what I think has provoked so many 9/11 related conspiracy theories. It does, after all, represent an incredibly convenient implement for an authoritarian state. It's a justification for any sort of curtailment of rights, and a corresponding agency undermining fear among the citizenry. Now, while it is plausible for state actors to have perpetrated the attack itself, it's also no more likely than the attack having been a genuine terrorist attack produced by state incompetence in catching the perpetrators, or, for that matter, possibly complicity on the part of the state. I can't really say for sure. But this isn't a video about 9/11, so don't at me about your ridiculous conspiracy fantasy blog or whatever. Hopefully you can see the similarities in the discourse to the COVID pandemic. Infectious disease experts have been telling us that global pandemic has been coming for, decades now. And there's been numerous examples in history, and even a few dress rehearsals in recent years. Remember SARS? Despite the known evidence for a risk, with unknown but potentially catastrophic severity, we basically had our pants around our collective ankles when it actually happened. Combination of hubristic exceptionalism and the illusion of safety from not having had a living memory of such an event in our past. Now, much like Chernobyl, the pandemic itself hasn't changed the likelihood of a pandemic occurring, although the worsening of this pandemic is very much a possibility. But our perception of this risk has risen dramatically. And similarly to the security theater of 9/11, the unknown unknowns of this virus, particularly in the early days when we just didn't know what was happening, have driven us to some strange ways of thinking. The unfortunately low level of scientific literacy, rampant misinformation, and politicization, suspicion, and general paranoia produces everything between obsessive germophobia to total denial of the pandemic itself. In light of the unknowns, the likelihood and severity of both personal and social risk, the pragmatic position is likely somewhere closer to germophobia, but this too is hampered by dogmatism and superstition. In the last year I've watched as people put on latex gloves to go shopping and then lick the finger of their gloves to grab onto a produce bag, or wear a mask while sitting alone in their own car, or most commonly wearing a mask over their mouth and not over their nose, or pulling down their mask to talk at somebody at close distance, when obviously the mask doesn't do any good when you do that. And unfortunately, public policy has been overwhelmingly reactive instead of proactive, shutting the barn door after the horses have already fled. Had North American governments handled the pandemic like China or New Zealand or Australia, we probably wouldn't be facing a deadly third wave here in Canada, and the vaccine would be a relieving coda to a mildly irritating year. Although the politicization of pandemic control measures can be largely explained through economic and partisan terms, I would assert that the denialism can be largely explained by America's experience with 9/11. In the last 20 years since 9/11, it's been that long. Anyway, the continuous use of phantoms to induce the illusion of risk has reached oversaturation, throwing off our collective tolerance for risk and generating a deep distrust of security theatrics overall. Having been manipulated so often using the same genre of risk orientation, when an actual risk emerges, it can be difficult to discern whether it's just a new variation on the theme. Of course, this isn't the only factor at play. Also is involved is a combination of macho culture, seeing precautionary measures as a sign of weakness, or the naturalistic fallacy, or, whatever else. But those are topics for another video. Unfortunately for all of us, the pandemic is indeed real, and as severe and as risky as it is being communicated. But the consequence of this mass distrust of authority is evident in the tragic loss of life. But at the same time, concern itself, is not entirely unwarranted. Even if the pandemic is real, which it is, and extraordinary measures are indeed required to control it, there is nonetheless an opportunity for both state and non-state actors to exploit the crisis to nefarious ends. Naomi Klein's notion of disaster capitalism from her work The Shock Doctrine is quite relevant here, illustrating the tendency for capital and the imperial powers backing it to exploit crises to accumulate power. Although legitimately justifiable as a pandemic control measure, we should stay wary of the curtailment of our access to public space, of our submission to surveillance, and the centralization of economic power through the discourse of essential goods and services. Much like how 9/11 became a low watermark in a continuous ratcheting up of security culture, COVID may similarly represent a resurgent and escalating immunological paradigm, as described by Byung-chul Han. Now, I'm aware, of course, that the same logic can be used to generate general suspicion of the vaccine, or of the mask wearing, or any other pandemic control measure, or even of the existence of the virus itself. But maintaining these paranoid fantasies requires one to willfully disregard clear and obvious evidence to the contrary, and also can't really coherently explain what the motivation or effects of something like this would be. Like, why would you come up with this kind of a conspiracy theory? Even though the pervasion of risk orientation and history of deception is actually real, scientific literacy and logic can confirm that there are some things that you can trust. Denialism and contrarianism is not the same thing as critical thinking, after all. If all goes well, the pandemic will be mostly over soon. But we won't be returning to the way things were, for good or for ill. We should definitely maintain a high level of skepticism and suspicion in order to resist this new episode of security theater, but it should also be tempered by a resistance against paranoia, which is as powerful a method of social control as what it combats. Anyway, I make videos daily, and so if you enjoy this content, like it, share it, subscribe, all those algorithmic things, and maybe consider checking out some of those videos, because I think they're pretty cool too. And so thanks for watching. I'll see you tomorrow.